Say one thing about the first law, say it's overrated. No matter which fantasy top list you open, this trilogy will most likely be among the top 3, if not in the first place. The backbone of Lord of the Rings, plus Merlin storyline, some lore from Devil May Cry, a bit of vampire or if you will Vindigo themes, and all this with very generous borrowing of striking scenes from other works. And last but not least, the so-called deconstruction in the style of what if Gandalf wasn't a kind grandfather and Frodo never brought the ring to Mount Doom. It would seem that all the elements fit together quite well and provide an excellent foundation for a good and unusual plot. But that's exactly where the problems lie. In the story itself, the logic of what's happening, the world building, and the way the plot unfolds. The author jumps from one, let's call it sound cool scene to another without bothering to create a proper background to make them actually work. Even worse, the whole story is held together by because the author said so, and the use of Deus Ex Machina, which is a bit shameful for a modern literature. The plot of the Blade itself is practically missing until the very last 15% of the book, where it finally starts to appear. All the events in the first book, through mostly the same everyday scenes repeated over and over, have no real impact on the story. Luther's training, Lokta's whining, and other similar scenes are repeated many times, yet there is no development to justify their presence. The problems with the plot begin right from the start, when the Lokta torments the Merchants Guild. There's no conspiracy, he tortures them simply because he's a sadist, because Other returned from the last war alive and well, while he did not. And in fact, this is quite a good base for the character. Realistic, but that's where the positives end. Next, Lokta action receive approval from above. Why and for what purpose? Simply because that will show those filthy peasants, without any practical reason. The author makes heavy use of sound cool, actively borrowing famous scenes and plot devices, many of which have rightfully become clichés, because they work, but he doesn't bother giving them the proper background to actually make them work. For example, at the very beginning, a young beautiful merchant's wife and her old unpleasant husband, who she is happy to get rid of. So she gives the Inquisition hidden books from his double accounting. Sounds like a classical setup, doesn't it? But in Abercrombie version it doesn't work. The Inquisition confiscates all property from those they named traitor. So, the young wife didn't just get rid of her husband, but all her material possessions as well. Not very believable. But the real issue isn't even that. It's that all this tyranny of the merchants carries no plot weight. Even though it takes up a sizable portion of the first book, it has no further impact on the story. Nor is there any reaction from the world of the book to these events. Do you think other guilds or even ordinary citizens will be alarmed by the terror? No, no one will fear they might be the next. Unlike in the Accursed Kings, where after the Templars were crushed, the Jews and Lombards grew deeply worried that they could be the next to fall. Not even a single comment from the common folk about trade being disrupted. Nothing like that will happen either. Speaking of the economy, this repression not only has no effect on the development of the plot, but only makes the already existing problems worse. The world's economy is already in ruins. Peasants are rioting and forming a uprising, the nobility is broke, merchants are on the brink of bankruptcy, and on top of that, the Inquisition is coming after them. And yet somehow banks are sitting on unimaginable wealth, so vast that it allows them to bribe not only everyone within the country, but even entire neighboring nations. Of course, none of this makes any sense. Banks are part of the economy, an extension of it, not something from another dimension. If the union and everyone in it are broke, if there is no foreign trade, then the banks would be just as broke too. So it turns out the first book is basically about nothing. And even what little it has doesn't really add anything to the story. The whole story with the merchants is utterly absurd. There's no conspiracy against the king, the Inquisition is just torturing random people and anyone the Archlector happens to dislike. But when all this starts, instead of hiring an assassin to get rid of sick sadistic inquisitor, who by the way walks around the city completely unprotected, except for a meter-thick layer of plot armor, and whose elimination would have been easy, as the author later shows, the merchants hire an assassin to kill their fellow merchants who happen to end up on the Inquisition's list. It's like cutting the threads leading to them, so to speak, leaving loose ends. This plot twist is practically taken from any mafia movie. We have got a rat, except there is no conspiracy, no threat, and people are being tortured more or less at random. And the most important thing, this isn't the mafia, these are merchants. It's completely nonsensical and a prime example of how the author borrows familiar plot devices but doesn't bother to place them in the background where they would actually work. Plus there is the moment with catching that assassin, when the Inquisition decides to use the very first captured merchant as bait. Yet the moment of killer capture is completely skipped. The author simply leaves it off screen as if it doesn't matter. Why? Because he knows perfectly well that this entire merchant subplot has no impact on the story. What matters to him is showing off a sound cool scene, and he sees no reason to bother with the details. Why is that? Because it would be extremely difficult to write anything meaningful about the Inquisition suddenly letting go, I emphasize, a merchant who already told them everything. While the assassin for some reason decides to kill him anyway, even though all the random names he mentioned are already dead and his elimination achieves nothing. And of course the assassin gets caught in the most convenient way possible. The second book is in fact the best in trilogy. First of all, it actually starts to develop the plot. The book is divided into 3 parts. The first one, The War in the North, which is in itself a pretty good story. Yes, there are some silly moments as well, but nothing critical to the plot. Moreover, the key characters here are a gang of northern named men, former chieftains and the most renowned murderers, now exiles. The members of this gang are secondary characters in the trilogy, and that's a good thing, because secondary characters actually feels like a real characters, not just plot-driven NPCs like the main heroes. This gang has its own goals, its own ambitions, they make decisions and take initiative, rather than just waiting for orders from above. If they don't agree, they act on their own. Meanwhile, the main heroes are just amoebas with no will of their own, passively drifting through the plot and not even asking questions. Is it possible to write a book about an ordinary person who goes to work day after day, dreams of nothing, strives for nothing, and so on? Of course it is. But it won't make a good story. That's the problem with the main heroes of the first law. But I got a bit sidetracked. Overall, the part of the book about the war in the north is good, largely because the author doesn't try to play with any radical plot twists or deep intrigues, which he doesn't handle all that well. But even there are screw-ups, because, well, it's grimdark, and grimdark apparently, according to the author, means everything has to be about shit and peace. Of course, the term grimdark in literature is really just a marketing gimmick, slapped on wherever it doesn't belong, and sometimes authors even start competing over who can be the grimmest. So in the first books the words shit and peace appear so often they show up in almost every paragraph, and of course often completely out of place. But hey, grimdark! Fortunately, after the first book, the use of these words starts to decline, and they begin to appear where they actually make sense, rather than everywhere. So grimdark didn't bypass the war in the north either. When a woman is hit in the chest by an arrow, and they can't remove it immediately, the very same gang of the most experienced northern warriors and chieftains decides that, without any delay, because you know, there's a camp of surgeons just 10 minutes behind them, they need to push the arrow straight through, after which of course she dies. Naturally this comes across as complete nonsense and just another sound cool moment. Yes, historically arrows were sometimes pushed through when they were hard to remove by normal means, but through soft tissue, not a ribcage full of organs. This essentially is the main screw up in the northern storyline. Of course there are other stupid stuff too, like pretty much everything Crown Prince Ladisla does. All the Union generals acting like little children and doing who knows what instead of actually fighting the war. But since the Northern gang reacts appropriately, basically telling them to show it and that they won't take part in their nonsense, it works. If the Union soldiers I get to die, fine, but without them. They came to find not this nonsense. Overall, having that kind of reaction makes all of this feel right to the reader. The second plotline of the second book is about Glokta in besieged city, and this is where, let's say, the problems start. Here we see those attempts to play with grey morality, but they simply don't work because the world's economy in the book doesn't work in the first place. The captured traitor, who wanted to surrender the city without a fight and also happens to be the head of the Spice Merchants Guild, explains that everything was great before the Union took over. Trade was booming and there was friendship and fun all around. But once they took the city, everyone went bankrupt, because all the money was going to defense, which by the way didn't even exist, all locals hate them, and so on. So her idea was basically, let's just give the city back and go back to the old days when there was profit and good for everyone. And this could have worked. It could have been believable, if the author had bothered to build the background. The local branch of the bank simply hands Glokta 1 million of marks from its own reserves, which by the standards of the book world is astronomically huge sum, half of which Glokta uses to fortify the city, turning it into a fortress. And here the reader feels the resonance with the Spice Merchant verse. If she were telling the truth, the local bank branch wouldn't be insanely rich. And no, this money coming from the local branch itself, not quickly transferred from the mainland. So there are only two possibilities. Either the merchant is plainly lying, or the author's word doesn't make sense. The correct answer is the second one, but at this stage the reader doesn't yet have all the information to be certain. So what does the reader conclude? Exactly, her words are just the evasions of a traitor, and capturing and holding the city was more than worth and strategically important. All of the author's attempts at grey morality here go completely to waste. Moving on, another sound cool moment, the idea that Inquisitor arrives in a peaceful besieged city and, instead of simply letting it surrender to avoid bloodshed, while the locals could continue living their lives, he forces them to fight. This leads to a massacre, with nearly all the city defenders dying, and the Inquisitor himself just goes home at the last moment. And again, this simply doesn't work. First of all, the city located on a peninsula is under siege and communication with the capital is by sea. But the port is soon fully captured, completely isolating the city. And yet, letters from Archlector, ordering Glokta to retreat and others to stand their ground to the death, keep arriving. How this is supposed to happen? Who knows? Glokta and few members of his retinue are feared more than the 1,000-strong enemy force. The general suggests an evacuation. No, we stand to the last man. And everyone like, alright then. Mind you, a significant portion of the defenders are mercenaries, notorious for switching sides like gloves. Eventually Glokta comes to the city ruling council and says something, well, it's been fun but I'm off. And they all go, oh sure, let us shake your hand, you are such a great guy. Seriously? Does anyone actually think that's how it would go? That they just let him walk out? Or not hand him themselves for that matter? What's especially funny is that they also present it as if Glokta is in danger once he returns. Like he was supposed to hold the city, but it fell, so now he's in trouble. But there is absolutely nothing to make the reader actually believe that. And the thing is, they also pull this trick with Glokta 4 or 5 times through the trilogy. In the end, it just gets tiring and Glokta just acts like a drama queen. Something like Cleopatra from old cartoon. Always written over and over again to show the ghouls how a queen dies. So yeah, Glokta somehow, by some kind of magic as always, the author just leaves it off screen, managed to safely leave the city that almost completely overrun and cut off from the rest of the world. And he does it after calmly packing his luggage first. And here it's worth pointing out that Glokta is a crippled character with major physical limitations, which could be a pretty interesting setup. The problem is, all these limitations are purely decorative. The author shows us scenes where Glokta messes himself in bed, constantly complains about his teeth, which by the way is more horrifying by our standards than a medieval setting, where missing teeth weren't that shocking. The character is always mourning that without teeth he has to eat liquid porridge and broth, and how he misses meat so much. Anyone ever heard of Pateas, by the way? And yet, despite all this, Glokta's physical weakness doesn't in slightest get in the way of what he does. Across the entire trilogy, there isn't a single moment where his body actually fails him a crucial time and negatively affects his character. Even his incontinence happens strictly in his bed, not say during a meeting with the Arch-Lector. In that sense, Raistlin or Elric are on a whole different level when it comes to portraying characters with physical weaknesses. And yeah, we should also add that grey morality with peaceful surrender of the city just doesn't work, because on the other side we have got a slave-owning empire led by a cult of cannibals. You get the idea, it's like voluntarily walking into the lion's den. And while we are on the subject of a time period, the world is your typical pseudo-medieval setup, yet there is a ton of stuff straight out of a later, call it Napoleonic, era. The way people live, dress, the very existence of regular army, social etiquette, it's all stick out and just doesn't feel organic. So look, on one hand we have armor, knights and all that, but on the other hand nobody actually uses it. Everyone just wears red uniform with dual weapon like rapier and daggers. The only time someone actually puts on armor is at the very end of the third book. At the same time, in the world of the book, the main reason for switching to this kind of equipment, firearms, is absent. Overall it's not the worst thing, but the world as a whole feels incoherent. The third plotline is Bias, with his Fellowship of the Ring, both in spirit and in essence. But extremely, how should I put it, dull, empty and superficial. When you read these parts, you can't help but wonder why it feels so meaningless. And when you finish, it becomes clear. It's because it's all just one big joke in a deconstruction style. And since it's all a joke, the author never fully committed to this part of the story. It's like if Frodo at the end of his journey tripped and broke his neck, and Tolkien had planned it that way in advance, making his journey to Amon Amas completely empty. Personally, I think the Frodo section in Lothlórien are already the weakest, both in book and the movie, but that's a matter of taste. All through Bias' whole expedition to find the super weapon, practically nothing happens. Every event feels like it's just ticking a box. Oh no, we have been attacked. By who? Bad guys who want to stop us. Who are they? Why? How did they even know we are here? None of that matter, because it's all just filler. Or take the part where they go through the local version of Moria, chased through the ruins by Shenka, the local stand-ins for orcs. And it doesn't even matter that none of it makes any sense, because this so-called Moria used to be the old capital, the place where the piece of demonic uranium was first used, after which even the ground itself became dead. Now it's just ruins. No life, no animals, no insects, no plants, not even birds flying there. And yet, out of nowhere, the Shenka suddenly show up. What are they even eating there? Each other? What's funny is that the author originally presents the Shenka as this global, unstoppable threat that going to pour down from the north and wipe everything out. But in reality, nope. They only appear a couple of times across the trilogy and barely matter at all. So they just show up out of nowhere, because the author apparently needed another bit of filler for this empty journey. And hey, everyone loves a good Moria sequence, right? Other than that, nothing really happens in this storyline, but there is one bright spot. Bias shares little tales about world's mythology. Basically, it's like Devil May Cry, except the local Sparda had more kids, and those kids went on to take their own apprentices, forming the first clans of first mages. In short, it's interesting, mainly because all of this is made up of proven story formulas that just work. And yeah, when you finally get to the end of the storyline, after Logan talks to the spirit who, instead of handing over magical uranium, just gives him a regular stone, everything clicks. The reason this whole journey feels empty becomes clear. It's just a joke about an epic quest that ends with nothing. And honestly, this could have worked. The heroes set out for a super weapon meant to save everyone, fail, and are left to figure out another way on their own. That's a perfect setup for something interesting. But no, in true Deus Ex Machina fashion, the artifact is just handed to them once they return home. And that's it. By the way, speaking of borrowing from Lothlórien, there is also a local Caradhras, except here it's a river, and across the entire continent you can only cross it via 2 bridges. The one the heroes need, destroyed. So of course, they have to go through the old capital, which is basically Moria. A river that can't be crossed anywhere else. Yeah, that's interesting. Alright, let's discuss talking with spirits. In the local mythology, it's one of the three branches of magic of this world, originated from one of the sons of the local Spada. And it shows up in the story about once per book. Twice as a cheap plot trick, first to steer Logan towards the mage even though he had exactly zero reason to look for him, then the conversation with the spirit guardian of the magical uranium, and the third time, pure info dumping about feared vulnerability. So the whole mechanic of talking with spirits is completely unjustified and used as a cheap plot device. In fact, in Feared's case, it only makes the story worse. Instead of Logan figuring things out himself, he is handed all the necessary information. His friends had already told him that hidden Feared in exposed flesh did nothing, and figuring out that people wear armor on the parts they want to protect, not exactly a rocket science. But no, instead we get an info dump just to make it look like the spirit token actually matters in the story. It's also worth noting another point. During the journey, Bias apprentice Kwai basically stops being a character. The author almost completely ignores him, and even his companions seem to forget he exists. It's really noticeable. Later on, this is somewhat explained by the fact that it's no longer Kwai but Ptolemy, the granddaughter of the local Spada and former lover of Bias, until he threw her off the roof. And you could count that as positive point, but it still feels like the author didn't bother much with it. But in reality, it ends up causing way more problems than it solves. See, Ptolemy hates Bias for killing her and her father, yet at the same time she's desperate to get the seed, the same demonic uranium. So she pretends to be his apprentice, even though it done really badly. Up to this point, it's logical. But when it turns out Bias has no idea where the real stone is, she has exactly zero reason to keep him alive. But wait, the illogical stuff doesn't stop there. Demon Blood can sense the stone. When Farah ends up in a town near the tower, she drones to it like a magnet. Yet Ptolemy, who lived in the tower and had direct contact with the stone, somehow doesn't sense it at all. And keep in mind, Ptolemy is the demon's granddaughter, while Pharaoh is some distant generation who barely has anything left of her demonic ancestry. By the way, about the replacement of Kwai. At the end of the first book, they find a mutilated body right in the center of the capital. But the Inquisition, prompted by Superior Goyle, covers it up, threatening Glokta to drop the investigation. What could possibly justify such a logical behavior? Only personal involvement, either Goyle himself, maybe if he has an Eater in his retinue, or the Inquisition as a whole. That would actually make sense, especially since in the third book we find out that Archlector Salt is trying to contact the other side. So, for example, if he were covering up Ptolemy and in return she was helping him with demonology, that would be logical. But no, there is no connection between them and the investigation gets buried just because. That's the plot for you. The third book continues to be intense in terms of plot development, which is good. But let's take it step by step. The War in the North continues with a depiction of the local version of the Battle of the Helm's Hollow, with the help arriving on the 8th day. And that's basically the end of it. Victory. There will also be Logan's Duel, which by the way is a game built on Lota. More precise, it's based on the original movie plan, where Aragorn delivered the killing blow to Sauron at the exact moment the ring fell into the lava, which would have looked way better than the duel with the troll in the final version. Here, Logan fights Feared while the witch fueling him with power is killed by Black Dow, Grim and Dogman. Aside from the already mentioned spirit conversation about Feared's vulnerability, this part is actually done very well. By the way, after the duel there is another attempt at grey morality, and again it fails. When the king in the north bettered, claims it was all Logan's fault. That it was him, back when he still served bettered, whose bloodlust stirred up too much hatred, and that the king had no way to resolve the disputes peacefully. And as I said, none of this actually works, because Better's main argument, I quote, is "I wanted none of this, just a little land and a few victories." I think Hitler might have said something similar. On top of that, the king allied himself with Shankers, those same local orcs. Yeah. So after this, the story essentially shifts to the siege of Minas Tirith, with the Rohirrim coming to an aid to nearly fallen city. And instead of the army of the dead, there is the same magical uranium. In short, I will repeat myself, the Northern War storyline, just like in the second book, is done well. There are still downsides though. For example, the very setup for a siege of the local Helm's Hollow is purely lazy plot device. Supposedly, if the Allied Northern forces led by the Exiles break off from the Union army and head into the mountains, the all-seeing Witch of Betet will spot an easy target and the King in the North will of course take the bait. The problem is that the all-seeing Witch would also notice the Union reinforcements coming to help. But anyway, of course it's a narrative convenience through a tolerable one. As for Bias' storyline, it's total mess. And it just keeps getting worse. Let's start with the change in the royal line. The king is a puppet, and his two heir sons are just as clueless, posing absolutely no problem for Bias. His only real obstacles are Ash Lecter Salt and High Justice Morovia, two top-level bureaucrats who act far too independent for their own agendas. You'd think, well, just eliminate them and put someone else in charge, which by the way he actually does. Morovia gets killed by Bias Underland the Eater, who so conveniently pops up everywhere the plot needs help, while Salt is simply thrown into prison. But no, for some reason Bias decides to kill the king and his heirs and put a new one on the throne. Why? Just to give the book another sound cool moment. His Eater kills the king, kills one of the sons, and another one, purely by chance, die up in the north, even though he should have returned home victorious. Meanwhile, the two main officials, Sult and Morovia, for whom the change in the royal line is direct danger, what do? That's right, they once again cover up the investigation and execute the unfortunate imperial ambassador who wanted to make peace, which of course inevitably lead to a war Union is completely unprepared for. So, what's the logic behind their actions? Exactly, none. They act not according to their characters, but simply because it's convenient for the author. The whole Merlin plotline is telegraphed almost from the very moment Bias and Luther first meet, and how should I put it? The reader can hardly believe what's unfolding. It's hard to accept that the author is actually trying to push through such an illogical and absurdly out-of-place storyline. So in order to put a new king on the throne, namely Luther, Bias starts building up his reputation by spreading rumors about made-up acts of heroism and pushing him up the ranks. And finally he instructs his Eater to lead a people's uprising, since, as I already mentioned, the Union economy is in terrible shape and everyone is dirt poor. The rebellion grows huge in scale and even managed to defeat a couple of noblemen who were sent with small armies to suppress it. Then Luther is dispatched with a laughably small force and equally laughable concessions, to which the Eater leader says, "Alright, we accept." His lieutenant, who disagrees, is immediately arrested and that's it. Luther becomes the hero who ended the uprising. I don't even know how to comment on that. I mean, who in their right mind would think that 40,000 people who have risen up against oppression, spilled blood more than once, not just waved a few protest banners, would suddenly just go home after their leader told them so? No, that's not how it works. In the best case scenario, he'd simply stop being their leader. In the worst, they'd put him on a pitchfork. But in this another sound cool moment, it somehow works. Because agree, it does sound epic. The Union's Grey Cardinal Bias staging a fake uprising just to make a hero out of the future king. Powerful stuff. Well, as long as you don't think about it for more than 2 seconds. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. All the glorifying of Luther is fine and all, but it's the nobles who actually vote. So Bias just bribe every single one of them to vote the way he wants. So let's summarize. Bias already had control over the common folk, the means to manipulate the entire nobility, and the power to eliminate anyone he wished. Which raises the question, why bother changing the king at all, if all the power was already in his hands? His only real dissatisfaction was with 2 officials, whom he ends up getting rid of anyway. So summarizing the plot, Bias orchestrates a war between the Empire and the Union, even though neither the Union nor Bias is actually prepared for it. The few troops they have are already stuck in the Northern War, there is no weaponry, including the mage's very super weapon. But then a Deus Ex Machina happens with the discovery of magical uranium, and the vast Imperial army, armed better than anyone else in the world, with military machines and weapons including never seen before gunpowder bombs, is turned into a bunch of frightened peasants who run away in terror at the sight of 100 Northmen. And all of this is presented with unprecedented pomp and confidence in the brilliance of the plot, as if Baez foresaw everything, planned every step, and had all the cards in his hands from the very start, controlling everything at every stage. In reality, none of this is true. The entire story rests on plot armor at its worst and Deus Ex Machina. The story only works because the author says it does. Let's speak a bit about Sound Cool and Grimdark. Luthor's marriage. The princess acts like the best wife in the world in public, but the moment they are alone in the bedroom, she hits the king in the fruits, as the book puts it, and sends him off to sleep on the couch. So how is this even supposed to work? This is the level of a joke, not a free-volume epic. Has anyone ever heard of Henry VIII? There's the whole set of options right there for what would happen with a queen like that. All in all, I don't even want to waste time explaining how utterly absurd this is. All of it exists just to impress the reader with yet another Sound Cool, where the cruel inquisitor first perceives that the queen is actually a lesbian, and then, by kidnapping her lover, blackmails her into sleeping with her husband the king. Ooh, grimdark. And a bit about the characters. All through many praise them as phenomenal, in practice they are all very flat. Glokta is a cripple whose disability is purely decorative and doesn't interfere with his actions. Overall, his crippleness is one of the two main sources of so-called grimdark in this book, the other being the constant mentioning of shit and peace. And this is the first book where a woman's yellow eyes are compared to what? Gold, amber, wheat, sun? Yes, to peace. Honestly, I was a bit surprised they also stopped there and didn't go on to compare her brown skin to something. In fact, such a comparison does exist, but in the next book. There, however, it comes from the mouth of Senior Inquisitor Haka, a character that also clearly made entirely despicable. In that context, the comparison doesn't cause any resonance and fits the character. As for Haka, the idea is so to speak understandable, but the fact that this character will be criticized by Glokta, a maniac who basically does nothing but torture innocent people for fun, ends up looking a bit ridiculous. Actually very ridiculous. By the way, it's worth noting two extremely positive aspects in the book. The first is Glokta's excuses. I mean, as I said, he's basically a maniac, but he doesn't admit it to himself and tries to justify his actions as a search for some mythical truth. Meanwhile, it's obvious to the reader that it's all self-delusion. It's a good touch, because that's often how it is in real life. No one ever considers themselves truly bad, not even maniacs. The second moment is that characters can lie. Too often in a fiction everything is taken as truth, and the readers don't even ask himself where, for example, the pedophile in Lolita is telling the truth. Can you even trust such characters? Here it's shown very clear. These are really good moments. They don't save the plot, but they are a big plus for the trilogy. But returning to Glokta. Essentially there is no complexity in his character. He obediently follows orders over and over until the very end, and at least some initiative only appears in the last 5% of the book. He follows orders, tortures innocent people, and takes pleasure in it. The author presents him as very clever, but in fact there is nothing clever in his actions. The character just has 10 layers of plot armor. By the way, another Sound Cool moment is when they decide to kill Glokta. Instead of normal assassination, the author shows us a scene straight out of Snatch, where a gangster threatens to kill and feed to the pigs. Naturally, it makes no sense here. After that, Glokta himself even says that it was incredibly stupid, and all you can do is agree with him. It's really stupid, because the scene has no background and doesn't follow the logic of the world. In the end, it simply doesn't work. Logan is sort of Khan the Betrayer, but wimpy. He appears in two forms. The first is grumbling old man who constantly tells everyone what his father used to say, and the second is when he goes into Berserk mode, in which he's invulnerable and kills all living things, except for other characters with plot armor, like Pharaoh. Is it interesting? Not really. And the question arises, yes, everyone in the North despises him, but it's unclear why after all these years they haven't collectively killed him like the mad dog he actually is, exactly like the author shows us at the very end. Luther is, for the most part, a filler character. He gets a lot of screen time, yet repeatedly comes across as ridiculously stupid and ignorant. There's supposed to be some character growth, especially in the final part where he tries to be a good king, but as I already said, the characters are more like NPCs, they don't take initiative. Luther keeps complaining that Bias controls him, yet he doesn't even make a single attempt to get rid of the mage, when even a simple stone to the head would be more than enough, but Bias' plot armor is even thicker than Glokta's. Ah yes, before I forget, the Deus Ex Machina with the magic stone is roughly like Jon Snow's death in Game of Thrones. Namely, if the author isn't willing to deal with the consequences of a plot development, then the development itself is worthless. Jon is killed, and yes, the death of major character is a powerful move that carries significant consequences for the story, but no, he's resurrected in the very next episode, negating what happened. In the other words, the value of the event is zero. The same goes for the stone. If the author gives it to the characters anyway after showing that the search was unsuccessful, the value of the part of the story instantly drops to zero. Pharaoh is basically a plot prop. In fact, she could be removed from the story and no one would notice. She's needed in the story only to hold the stone. As a character, she's 90% me vengeance, me kill, me dangerous, me hate all, and in such exaggerated forms that it comes across as downright cartoonish. Besides, she barely gets any screen time. And overall, when it comes to characters, even a secondary one like Shivers, a young Nazarman who along with his warriors switched to the side of good, shows far more initiative and pursues his own goals much more actively than any of the main characters. By the way, there is a funny moment with Shivers. When he switched sides, one of his reasons is that bettered alliance with the Shenka, something that of course can't be tolerated. And yet, literally in the very next scene, when those same orcs show up in the enemy army, Shivers is genuinely surprised to see them there. Well, what can I say, quite the mystery indeed. In general, whenever a story features some kind of inquisition, the reader expects suspense, intrigue, conspiracies, investigations, basically a detective-style narrative. But no, instead we get just rather mild descriptions of tortures and that's it. In the first book, nothing at all. In the second, you can say there is something resembling intrigues, but it's resolved in the most primitive way possible. They capture an ambassador and torture him until he gives up the name of the spy. And surprise surprise, the ambassador just happens to know the spy's name. How convenient. So in reality, any real intrigues only shows up at the very end of the third book when Glokta finally starts behaving like an actual character and showing some initiative. So in the end, we are left with a world where you can calmly kill King and his heir, and no one will even raise an eyebrow. There won't even be an investigation. Yet at the same time in this very world, they somehow can't manage to kill a crippled man who just wanders the streets on his own. Overall, the story feels like it's written in a TV show style, where the big picture isn't really important as long as there is a sound cool moment to wow the audience right now. Take for instance this scene when Logan mistakes an old man with beard, a rope and a staff for Bias. But no, Bias is a blacksmith. A fairly common trope, don't judge a book by its cover, and here we supposedly have not your typical wizard but something more complex. There's just one problem. Later on, Bias behaves exactly like the most typical wizard imaginable, showing not the slightest interest in any kind of physical labor. By the way, this scene is similar to the one where we first meet Tywin Lannister, the one where he personally skins a stag. It looks powerful, sure, but later on you never see Tywin act like this again. On the contrary, he will carry himself like an important noble and let the peasants deal with such sins. Another one of those moments that's supposed to look cool but makes absolutely no sense, the finale when Glokta comes to the university with a squad of cutthroats to get salt. There he met by Vitari, with forces far superior to his own, and Glokta decides to bluff, claiming he got her children and if anything happens to him they will be killed. Another sound cool scene that meant to impress the reader with how Glokta guesses where and when Vitari hid her kids. But what does Vitari do? No, she doesn't grab the kidnapper of her children, even though he's completely at her mercy. No, she let him go, even pleading with him not to hurt the kids. And where does she let him go? Straight into the place where there is a good chance he will be killed on the spot. Which by the bluff's logic would mean death for her children too. In short, it's another situation that only works because they also say so. If Vitari at least switched sides to Glokta and later tried to protect him, sure, that would be believable, but as it is, no. By the way, Vitari herself is yet another grimdark joke. A deranged maniac who loves strangling people and at the same time a loving single mother of several kids. Very believable. The book certainly has its good moments, but let's be honest, the plot isn't one of them. And despite the trilogy being positioned as deconstruction, the author ultimately backs away from his most prominent ideas. In the end, what we get is essentially just an edgy version of Lothar. But as a Lothar-like story, it's simply unable to compete with something like Dragonlance, which is arguably the best in that niche. Nor does it have a unique and captivating fantasy world like Dark Sun. A pseudo-Great Britain, a pseudo-Ottoman Empire, it's all rather plain. And perhaps the most ironic part, despite being a fantasy series, there is very little actual fantasy in the books. And it plays a fairly minor role. As a result, the book ends up competing with historical novels too, like Accursed Kings or Shogun, which is a tough match for the first law.